In just 92 seconds, Donald Trump screamed "Get out!" at Jasmine Crockett on Live TV, and that's when the chamber exploded. Millions watched as she fired back with words so lethal they froze him in silence. Gasps, chaos, and shouting turned Congress into a battlefield of power and rage. What did Jasmine say that shattered Trump's swagger in front of the entire nation? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under a sky streaked with gray, Washington, D.C. felt less like the capital of a nation and more like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Barricades sliced the avenues in two, holding back seas of people that pulsed and screamed in unison. On the left, a tide of red MAGA caps rose and fell, fists pumping to the chant of Trump, Trump, Trump. On the right, banners painted in hurried strokes lifted high, Justice for all, Stand with Jasmine. The nose clashed in the air like iron against iron, each word sharpened into a weapon. Above it all, helicopters prowled, their blades chopping the sky, their searchlights carving white wounds through the winter haze. Across the country, every television screen bore the same blazing banner: Live. Inside the Capitol, the silence was not peace but pressure, thick, suffocating, electric. Reporters hunched in corners, pens trembling against paper, knowing they were minutes away from witnessing something that would split the nation's memory into before and after. Security guards shifted in place, hands tight on their belts, eyes darting as if they too felt the building itself holding its breath. This was no hearing, it was a trial by fire, and the flames were already licking the edges of the chamber. Then, footsteps, slow, certain. Jasmine Crockett emerged from the tunnel beneath the Capitol, her heels cracking against the marble like the ticking of a countdown bomb. She carried no entourage, no grand gesture, only a thin red folder in her hand, its contents unknown but whispered about in the halls of power like a forbidden prophecy. Her face betrayed nothing, not fear, not doubt, only resolve. Behind her eyes flickered the weight of entire communities, the voiceless, the unheard, the silenced. She was walking not just for herself but for them, and she knew the room she was about to enter was built to break people like her. Still, she walked. From another entrance came the storm. Donald Trump strode into the gallery to a roar that shook the rafters. His people rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, their voices raw with loyalty. He paused at the threshold, chin lifted, savoring the sound like a man who believed he owned it. With a smirk curling across his lips, he threw a glance toward Jim Jordan and muttered, "Watch me bury her." The words hung in the air, caught by hot microphones, carried instantly into living rooms across America. The chamber braced itself, to forces one fueled by fury and entitlement, the other by truth and defiance were about to collide under lights so bright they felt like judgment itself. Senators shuffled papers they would not read. Reporters steadied their cameras. Citizens at home leaned forward in their chairs. Outside, chests pounded like drums of war, the city vibrating with every syllable. This was no longer a hearing. It was a battlefield where every sentence could ignite a nation, every silence could speak louder than a shout. Some hearings change policies, tonight could change America itself. Are you ready to witness it? The first blow landed like a gunshot. Trump leaned forward, voice amplified through the chamber's microphones, his words slicing the air. "You're a nobody lawmaker, Crockett. A lightweight. If you can't handle Texas, then get out and let real leaders run this country." The gallery erupted. Some laughed, others gasped, the sound bouncing off marble walls like ricocheting bullets. Reporters' heads froze mid-sentence, cameras zoomed in tight, capturing the smirk stretching across Trump's face, a performance stage for millions watching live at home. For a moment, it looked like he had seized the upper hand. But then the lens shifted to Jasmine. She did not flinch, did not even blink. Her eyes, dark and unshaken, locked on him with the steadiness of someone who had endured worse insults in backrooms where no cameras rolled. She drew in one long breath, the kind that centers a fighter before the counterpunch. That her silence cut sharper than any word, and the audience felt it. The air thinned, tension thickened, and the sound of distant protesters outside the Capitol seemed to echo louder inside the chamber itself. On social media, the wildfire had already begun. Within seconds, #Trump vs Crockett shot into the trending list. Clips of his insult replayed in real time, spliced with memes, outrage, and anticipation. Twitter feeds flooded with one question: how would she answer? Allies whispered from the Democratic bench, urging restraint, while Trump's circle chuckled among themselves, certain they had just humiliated her. Yet the cameras lingered on Jasmine, waiting, hunting for a flicker of weakness that never came. She let the pause stretch just long enough to unsettle the room, her fingers resting lightly on the red folder in front of her. Her gaze never left Trump's, and in that stillness, it felt as though she had turned the insult back on him, making him the one under scrutiny. The chamber grew restless. The man who lived on nose had just created the perfect stage for her silence. When she finally moved, it was not with words, but with a subtle, deliberate gesture, her hand tapping the folder once, like a signal. It was enough to send whispers through the press section, speculation firing like sparks in dry wood. What was in that file? Why did she seem so certain? Trump shifted slightly, his smirk faltering just for a fraction of a second, caught by cameras already hungry for cracks in his armor. The moment held like a cold spring, ready to snap. Trump had thrown his insult with all the force he could muster, but Jasmine's calm was heavier than rage. The nation leaned closer, breathless, because they sensed what he did not, that the next move was hers, and it would not be words thrown carelessly into the air, but something lethal, undeniable, irreversible. And the question hung over every screen in America. What kind of truth could silence even Donald Trump? The chamber erupted in uneven waves. On one side, Republicans shot to their feet, pounding the desks and clapping with theatrical bravado, their cheers a shield for Trump's attack. On the other, Democrats leaned inward, heads close, whispering strategy, like generals huddled before a battle. The contrast was jarring, half the room performing triumph, the other half calculating survival. Above them, the press gallery was a frenzy of motion, journalists scribbling in shorthand, eyes darting from Trump's smirk to Jasmine's stillness, sensing that every second was history being carved live onto the nation's memory. Then Jasmine moved. She rose slowly, not with the jerk of anger but with the pose of inevitability, the red folder glinting faintly under the harsh lights. Gasps rippled from the audience. They had all heard whispers about it, but no one had yet seen it raised in her hand. Her voice was low, steady, but it carried across the room. For too long, truths have been buried. Tonight, one of them comes into the light. The words dropped heavy, like the first roll of thunder before a storm. Trump leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that familiar smirk, the one designed to dismiss, to belittle. "Good luck, sweetheart," he sneered into the microphone, the word sweetheart rolling off his tongue like a weapon, condescending, cruel. Laughter bubbled up from his side of the aisle, but it was nervous, edged with something they couldn't name. For the briefest moment, the cameras caught him shifting in his seat, an involuntary flicker in his eyes that betrayed unease. The tension grew unbearable, thickening the air until even the sound of a pen scratching paper felt deafening. The chamber had transformed into something beyond a hearing. Every posture, every breath resembled a courtroom drama where one misstep could alter destinies. Spectators gripped the rails of the gallery, knuckles white, while outside the Capitol, chants and sirens bled faintly into the walls, reminding everyone that the streets, like the chamber, were waiting for what came next. Jasmine held the folder tighter. She did not look at Trump when she spoke again, but at the chamber itself, at the country beyond its walls. The people deserve to know what's been hidden from them. And tonight, they will. Her words landed like a gavel striking wood, final and unyielding. For the first time since the hearing began, the cheers faded, the whispers hushed, the laughter died. Every eye, every lens, every heartbeat locked onto her. And as she placed the folder on the desk before her, one truth became unavoidable. The room was no longer divided by party lines, but by fear and anticipation. What she was about to reveal had the power to shake not just Trump, not just Congress, but the very foundation of America. The question was no longer whether she would open it, but whether the nation was ready to survive what spilled out. Trump struck again, this time with the ferocity of a man who lived off the roar of the crowd. He leaned into the microphone, jabbing a finger across the chamber, his voice booming through the speakers. "Radical left trash, that's what you are, Crockett. A fake lawyer, a fraud, and the most un-American voice I'd ever heard in Congress." Each word was spit like venom. Each insult meant not just to wound her but to brand her in the eyes of the millions watching live. His allies erupted on cue, Jim Jordan pounding his fist on the desk, others shouting, "That's right." And tell her. The chamber shook with the nose, a wall of sound designed to bury her beneath it. Reporters craned forward, scribbling furiously, their eyes darting between Trump's blazing face and Jasmine's stillness. Camera operators tightened their zooms, catching every sneer, every bead of sweat, every twitch of Trump's jaw. It was chaos carefully engineered, and for a moment, it seemed the momentum belonged to him. The insult hung in the air, electric and cruel, like a whip cracking across the chamber. The Republicans laughed, their performance complete. The Democrats stayed seated, whispering frantically, unsure if this was the moment to interject or let Jasmine hold her own. And there she sat, silent, not cowering, not broken but watching. Jasmine's eyes never left Trump, her expression unreadable, as though she were studying the pieces of a chessboard only she could see. Her stillness was unnerving, her composure a kind of defiance stronger than any shouted rebuttal. She tapped one finger against the red folder before her, slowly, deliberately, the sound nearly lost under the din but caught by a nearby microphone. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't nervous, it was strategic, the kind of rhythm a fighter keeps when waiting for the bell. Trump mistook it for weakness. He pressed harder, spitting insult after insult. "You don't belong here. You're a disgrace to this institution. You should be ashamed to call yourself an American." His voice grew ragged, his face crimson, his words harsher with each breath. But the more he shouted, the calmer Jasmine appeared. Her silence became heavier, more suffocating than his fury, until even the cheering began to falter. Allies who had laughed moments earlier now glanced nervously at the folder, at the woman who refused to break. On social media, the storm intensified. Clips of Trump's rage lit up feeds, but so did Jasmine's stillness. Side-by-side images of his red face against her unflinching calm. Hashtags spread like fire. Hashtag Trump meltdown. Hashtag Crockett unshaken. Hashtag the red folder. The nation wasn't just watching, it was choosing sides in real time. And as the chamber simmered in the aftershock of his verbal blitz, the air shifted. Everyone could feel at the anticipation of a counterstrike, the certainty that silence this sharp was not surrender, but a cold spring waiting to snap. Trump had thrown fire, but Jasmine's answer would not come as mere sparks. The question now gripping every voice, every lens, every heart was this: would she fight fire with fire or deliver a truth so thunderous it burned louder than any flame? Jasmine rose, not with the fury they expected, but with the deliberate calm of someone who had chosen her moment long before stepping into the chamber. She adjusted the microphone, let the echoes of Trump's insults hang in the air a second longer, and then spoke, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "You don't own America, you don't own truth. And you don't even own your scandals." The word struck like steel, measured, undeniable, sharper because she didn't need to shout. For a heartbeat the chamber froze, the contrast between his rage and her precision too stark to ignore. Then came a sound that changed everything. She slid a flash drive into the console, pressed a button, and the chamber speakers crackled to life. The audio filled the hall, Trump's voice, unmistakable and unfiltered. "We can't let them in, they'll change the color of our country. Shut the doors, block them all." The words were ugly, dripping with contempt, a private remark now made public before millions watching live. Gasps tore through the gallery. Democrats sat up straight, their whispers silenced. Republicans shifted in their chairs, some staring at the floor, others fumbling papers as though the noise might drown out the truth. Trump's smirk evaporated, but he forced a chuckle, trying to wave it away, taken out of context. He barked, pounding his fist, but the damage was done. The audience had heard the raw words, context could no longer wash them clean. Cameras swung to capture every reaction: the dropped jaws, the clenched fists, the silence spreading like a shadow across his side of the aisle. Jasmine did not gloat, she stood still, letting the audio loop once more, her eyes fixed not on Trump but on the American people beyond the cameras. That's not leadership, that's not patriotism. That's fear dressed up as power, and America deserves to hear it without spin. Her voice sliced through the chamber like a verdict. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in applause, the tension climbing higher with every second. On social media, timelines exploded, clips of Trump's voice were replayed, dissected, memed, captioned. Hashtags multiplied: hashtag Trump exposed, hashtag color of our country, hashtag Crockett strikes. Pundits on live panels struggled to keep pace, some calling it a bombshell, others insisting the fallout would be catastrophic. And in the chamber itself, the atmosphere thickened with the sense that something irreversible had just occurred. Trump leaned forward, face flushed, eyes narrowing into slits. His hand clenched around the desk, knuckles white, as though gripping the last shred of control. Allies muttered, trying to regain momentum, but their words stumbled, their energy fractured. Jasmine remained unshaken, her silence between sentences more powerful than any insult he had hurled. But those watching closely saw something more, a spark in her eyes that hinted this was not her full arsenal. The folder remained unopened, her cards not yet fully revealed. This was only the opening strike, the first cut to pierce his armor. The deeper wound was still to come. And the nation leaned forward, breath caught in its chest, bracing for the truth sharp enough to bleed power itself. The chamber detonated the moment the audio ended. Jim Jordan shot up from his chair, veins straining in his neck, voice cracking as he bellowed into the microphone. Fake news. Fake news. His words weren't reasoned arguments, but panicked alarms, the desperate cry of a cornered soldier. Other Republicans joined in, pounding fists on desks, shouting over one another in a chorus of denial. The sound was deafening, raw chaos reverberating through marble walls that had heard centuries of history, but rarely a storm this volatile. Jasmine did not flinch. She stood in the eye of the hurricane, her posture unyielding, her voice a blade cutting through the nose. When a liar's cornered, he screams louder. America can see through it, the chamber stilled just enough for her words to land, slicing through the cacophony. A ripple of gasps spread across the gallery. Even those who came expecting blood sports were stunned by her precision. The cameras seized on her face, calm yet burning, and contrasted it instantly with the spectacle of red-faced men shouting like children caught in their own lies. Above, journalists, and into overdrive, laptops clatter, tweets shot into the digital void by the second. CNN's chyron was merciless. Crockett draws blood. Other networks scrambled for their angles, but the narrative was already writing itself. The fiery insults of Trump's allies reduced to white noise against the steady cadence of a congresswoman wielding truth like a weapon. On phones across the nation, feeds lit up with one question: was this the moment Trump finally met his match? Trump himself sat rigid, his smirk erased, his hands gripping the desk so tightly the knuckles whitened. Cameras zoomed in, capturing sweat gleaming across his temples, the fury simmering just beneath his silence. He had not yet spoken, but the rage was visible, radiating off him like heat from steel. Every spectator in that room sensed that the silence was not retreat, it was the culling of a spring about to snap. Democrats, for once, didn't whisper strategy. They simply watched her, almost in awe, realizing that Jasmine's restraint, her command of the moment, was something no memo or party whip could manufacture. The Republicans, however, were restless, their eyes flicking to Trump as though awaiting his eruption, unsure whether to keep shouting or brace for impact. The audience in the gallery leaned forward, caught between exhilaration and dread. Outside, the chants from the streets grew louder, as if the nation itself was pressing against the Capitol's stone walls, demanding to know who would win this war of words. Jasmine stood steady, the red folder still unopened at her side, her composure daring him to strike. The chamber had become a battlefield, her silence as cutting as her words, their nose as frantic as their fear. And yet, everyone knew the clash was far from over. Trump's fury had not yet been unleashed. The only question left, trembling in the air like the pull of a trigger, was this: when he finally struck back, could she withstand the full force of his rage? The room held its breath as Jasmine's hand rested on the red folder. For nearly an hour, it had been nothing more than a rumor in plain sight, whispered about in corridors and splashed across speculative headlines. Now, under the blaze of cameras, she slid it open. The sound of paper against leather seemed louder than the shouting had been. She drew out the first set of documents, holding them steady, her voice calm but heavy with intent. "These," she said, "are records of campaign donations funneled through Shell Corporation's money that traces back to foreign entities with direct ties to Moscow and Ankara." Gasps tore through the gallery, pens dropped mid-sentence, screens lit up as journalists scrambled to capture every word. Behind her, staff activated the monitors lining the chamber walls. Graphs and flowcharts bloomed across the screens, arrows stretching from obscure LLCs to PACs, signatures glaring in black ink, bank transfers glowing red like arteries carrying illicit blood. Numbers climbed in sharp, incriminating spikes, timelines lining up neatly with Trump's rallies and policy shifts. The evidence wasn't abstract, it was alive, staring back at the country in real time. Trump leaned back and let out a booming laugh that echoed unnaturally in the charred chair. He slapped the desk with one hand, smirk curling back into place. "Another hoax, another witch hunt, you people never stop, do you?" His words drew uneasy chuckles from his allies, but their voices were thinner now, their eyes darting to the screens they couldn't control. Jim Jordan tried to shout over it. "Fake, manufactured." But his voice cracked, drowned beneath the weight of images no one could unsee. Jasmine didn't break her stare. "If this is a hoax," she said evenly, "then why are these signatures yours?" With that, she tapped the screen where his name sat scrawled beside a check authorization. The image froze under the lens of the cameras, broadcast to millions watching at home. Silence slammed over the chamber. Trump's laugh faltered, lips tightening as the evidence lingered. Undeniable, unflinching. Journalists erupted into motion, phones buzzed, tweets fired like gunshots, and within seconds CNN's banner blazed. Crockett drops bombshell. Foreign money tied to Trump campaign. The chamber itself felt smaller, heavier, as though the walls had absorbed the shock and were now pressing inward. Trump waved a hand, his voice louder, harsher, but tinged with something brittle. "Total setup. Forged signatures, fake graphs. They've been after me since day one. And it's the same garbage every time." He pointed at Jasmine, trying to claw back control. "She's a fraud, she's staging this whole circus." But the room had shifted. Lawmakers on both sides shifted in their seats, unease cutting through party lines. For the first time, the certainty in Trump's voice sounded more like desperation. Jasmine said nothing further. She simply closed the folder with deliberate calm, letting the silence do the work his shouting could not erase. And as the world stared at the frozen image of his signature glowing on the screen, the question that gripped every mind was not whether this was another hoax but whether the real deception had belonged to him all along. The lights dimmed slightly as Jasmine signaled to the technicians. A screen flickered alive behind her, and for a moment the chamber was drenched in anticipation, every eye pinned to the unfolding image. Then the audio came first, Trump's unmistakable voice, raw, unguarded, not filtered through speeches or teleprompters, captured in its truest form. "We can't let them change the color of our country. Shut it down. Keep them out." The words echoed like a gunshot, ricocheting through the marble chamber, each syllable burning into the silence that followed. Gasps tore through the gallery, sharp and involuntary. A senator on the Republican side shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand rising to his collar as though the tie had suddenly become a noose. Others fidgeted, eyes darting anywhere but the glowing screen, while a few leaned back defiantly, arms crossed, wearing forced smirks that fooled no one. The Democrats sat in silence, wide-eyed, realizing the weight of what the country was now hearing. In the gallery above, spectators clapped hands over their mouths, some mouthing the words as if confirming they had heard correctly. For the first time, the noise was gone. The chamber was blanketed in a silence so total it screamed louder than any insult hurled before. Trump shifted in his chair, the flicker of unease caught in high definition by the cameras. He tried to summon a smirk, but his lips pressed too tight, his jaw locked. Jasmine turned, her figure backlit by the screen, her voice unwavering as it cut through the suffocating air. "That's your voice, that's your America. An America built on fear, exclusion, and division. But my mind is bigger than fear." She let the sentence hang, every pause deliberate, every word sharpened to pierce through the television screens of millions watching at home. On social media, the explosion was instantaneous. The clip replayed endlessly, spliced into reels, posted with captions like "He said it out loud" and "The mask is off." Hashtag surged, hashtag color of our country, hashtag Trump exposed, hashtag Crockett vs. Sphere. News networks scrambled to keep pace, analysts cutting into live coverage, voices hushed as they declared this the kind of moment that redefined elections, redefined legacies. Back inside the chamber, the silence became unbearable. A cough, a shuffle, the scrape of a chair leg, small sounds amplified into thunder under the tension. Some Republicans whispered frantically to staffers, others glared daggers at Jasmine as though their fury might undo what had been broadcast. Trump finally muttered, "Fake tape, manipulated." But even he didn't sound convinced, his voice trailing off as though he knew the denial rang hollow. Jasmine did not move closer. She didn't need to. Her stance, steady as stone, declared she had already taken the ground. The screen froze on his words, subtitles blazing across the bottom. "We can't let them change the color of our country," it lingered, unflinching, undeniable. And as the chamber sat in suffocating silence, the question pressed itself against every conscience present. Would they choose to cling to power tainted by fear, or dare to stand with courage that demanded a greater America? The chamber became a tomb. Trump sat rigid in his chair, eyes darting but his mouth refusing to open. For a man who had built his empire on nose-on rallies, on insults, on endless repetition, silence was unthinkable. Yet here it was, swallowing him whole. Cameras crept closer, lenses zooming in on the beads of sweat forming along his temple, the twitch at the corner of his lip, the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he searched for words that would not come. The seconds ticked by like a hammer striking metal. 10, 30, 60. By 92 seconds, the weight of that stillness had become unbearable. In the gallery, whispers rippled like wind through dry leaves. Spectators glanced at one another, wide-eyed, realizing they were witnessing something rarer than scandal. They were watching Donald Trump silenced on live television. A murmur of disbelief spread, some stifled laughter, others shaking their heads, unable to believe the spectacle unfolding before them. Democrats sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe, afraid to break the spell. Even Republicans shifted, in unease, their forced grins tightening as though holding back panic. Out in the streets, the echo of this silence traveled faster than sound. News networks clipped the moment in real time, cutting into live feeds with banners screaming, 92 seconds of silence, Trump stunned. On Twitter, the hashtag number 92 seconds detonated like dynamite, trending worldwide within minutes. Memes spread like wildfire, but so did solemn posts from ordinary citizens writing, "I never thought I'd see the day." The nation was not only watching. It was recording, archiving, searing this silence into history. Jasmine did not move at first. She simply stood, letting the moment expand, letting the silence devour him whole. When she finally leaned forward, her voice was almost a whisper, but it carried sharper than any shout. Silence speaks louder than lies. The words cut through the chamber like a scalpel, clean and merciless. Gasps erupted again, and even the clicking of cameras seemed hesitant, as if every sound risked breaking the fragile but monumental pause that had fallen. Trump blinked hard, finally shifting in his chair, gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles blanched. His mouth opened, then closed again. He shook his head, muttered something inaudible, but the damage was done. 92 seconds. That number alone would become the headline, the statistic replay endlessly, proof not of defeat, but of exposure. He hadn't lost an argument, he had lost his voice. Jasmine let her gaze sweep the chamber, not triumphant, not smug, but resolute, the weight of her words and silence together pressing against the hearts of everyone present. She knew this was not the end. Silence was a pause before the storm. The room, the nation, the world could feel it too. Trump's fury was cold, waiting, trembling like dynamite before the fuse, and the question clawed at every mind watching, gripping the chamber like a vice. Silence may have spoken louder than lies, but what kind of wrath would he unleash once his voice returned? The silence shattered like glass. Trump slammed both fists onto the desk, his face red, veins bulging, voice exploding through the chamber speakers with the force of a cannon. Bullshit. She's a liar, a fraud, a disgrace to Congress. The words weren't just shouted, they were hurled, each one dripping with venom, each one meant to erase the 92 seconds that had already burned themselves into history. His rage shook the air itself, and suddenly the room was no longer frozen but on fire. Republicans pounded their tables in unison, a chaotic drumbeat meant to drown out the tremor of panic that lingered beneath their nose. They shouted, "Here, here, and she's finished," as though volume alone could restore control. Jim Jordan stood, jabbing a finger at Jasmine, screaming until his voice cracked. The spectacle was primal, less a defensive Trump than a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls that had just been shattered. Their uproar was deafening, a storm of sound tearing through marble walls that had heard centuries of debate but rarely such unrestrained fury. Democrats rose in protest, demanding order, their voices clashing with the roar from across the aisle. "This is a disgrace," one shouted, while another hammered the desk with an open palm. The speaker's gavel pounded, but its rhythm was swallowed in the chaos. The the chamber descending into a battlefield of shouting, fists, and defiance. Spectators in the gallery lean over the rails, eyes wide, some recording on their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The scene was no longer politics, it was spectacle, raw and volatile, the kind that would be replayed endlessly on screens across the nation. Through it all, Jasmine stood still. She did not flinch when Trump's insults tore through the air like shrapnel, did not move as Republicans pounded their desks like soldiers rallying a war cry. Her gaze stayed fixed, calm yet searing, her silence a counterpoint to the chaos that raged around her. Cameras caught the contrast perfectly. On one side, red-faced men shouting themselves hoarse. On the other, a lone congresswoman, unmoved, her composure speaking louder than their fury. Reporters scribbled frantically, their tweets firing out into the world. Trump explodes on Crockett. Chamber descends into chaos. CNN's banner refreshed instantly. Trump loses control. Chamber in turmoil. Fox rushed to spin it differently, but even the anchors stumbled, forced to acknowledge the ferocity of the eruption. On social media, the divide sharpened, some cheering Trump's defiance, others marveling at Jasmine's calm amid the storm. The gavel struck harder, but the nose refused to die. Trump's voice cut through one last time, hoarse, spitting fire. She doesn't belong here, she doesn't belong in America. His words echoed like a curse, his rage naked, uncontrolled. And in that moment, the choice before the nation became brutally clear. Would America see truth in the calm of a woman, refuse to bow, or would it be blinded by the noise of men screaming to keep their power? The chamber was still vibrating from Trump's outburst, echoes of fists on desks and shouts of liar clinging to the air like smoke after an explosion. Then Jasmine rose. She did not slam her hand, did not lean into the microphone with rage, did not mimic the noise that had poisoned the room. She simply stood, spine straight, eyes unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, low enough to force the chamber to lean in, sharp enough to cut through the din like glass breaking. When men fear women with power, they scream. But history doesn't remember screamers. It remembers builders. The words struck harder than any insult. For a moment, there was no reaction, only silence stretching across the chamber, as though the room itself had to register the weight of what she had said. Then came the sound, a single clap from the gallery above, joined by another and another, until it rolled into a wave. Applause thundered through the rafters, shaking the chamber with something purer than chaos. Democrats rose first, then independents, and even a few Republicans looked away from Trump, hands hesitating before they too added to the noise. It wasn't just approval, it was release. Trump's face reddened further, his mouth opening as if to shout again, but the applause drowned him out. The cameras captured it all, the former president gesturing wildly, trying to claw back attention, while a congresswoman's measured voice had set the chamber on fire with hope instead of fury. Social media erupted. Within seconds, the phrase "history remembers" builders trended globally, plastered across banners, memes, and commentary. Clips spread across platforms with captions like "This is leadership" and "The calm that broke the chaos." Jasmine did not bask in the applause. She let it rise, then lifted her hand, and the chamber quieted. Her voice steadied again, each syllable precise. This seat, this chamber, this nation, none of it belongs to men who scream the loudest. It belongs to those who build a future that outlives them. And no matter how loud the noise, that truth cannot be drowned. The gallery fell quiet again, the words sinking deep, like stones cast into water, rippling outward beyond the marble walls to every home watching live. Reporters typed furiously, headlines already set. Crockett turns chaos into clarity. Analysts on live feeds scrambled to react, some calling it the sharpest line of the year, others admitting it might be the moment the balance shifted. Outside, the chants of protesters reached a fever pitch, but now one voice began to dominate, echoing Jasmine's line. Builders, not screamers. The words rolled across the crowd, picked up like a banner, chanted into the night. And in that chamber, the cameras pulled in tight on Jasmine's face, calm, resolute, unshaken by the storm she had just endured. Her voice had risen above the chaos once. But the question lingered, heavy as the silence that followed. Could one woman's voice truly rise high enough to heal a nation built on division? Trump's fury, already stoked to a blaze, turned darker, pettier, more venomous. He leaned into the microphone, lips curling, voice dripping with disdain. Look at her, a nobody from nowhere. She doesn't belong in this chamber. She doesn't even belong on this stage. Just another angry woman trying to play lawyer, pretending she's smarter than she is. His words slashed not at policy, but at personhood, not at argument, but at identity. He mocked her voice, her cadence, even the way she dressed, sneering as if reducing her to caricature might erase the power she had just summoned. Laughter uneasy, force rippled from a few of his allies, but most shifted uncomfortably, sensing the attack had gone too low even by his standards. The camera cut to Jasmine, her hands folded in front of her, face composed but eyes blazing. She did not move immediately, letting the cruelty hang in the air, letting America hear it raw and unfiltered. Then she stood, her voice steady, quiet enough to force the room to listen. I come from where struggle lives. From neighborhoods where children go to bed hungry, where mothers work to jobs and still can't keep the lights on. From families who had to fight for the right to be heard at all. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room, pausing on Trump, and that's why I'll never bow. Not to bullies, not to billionaires, not to fear. The chamber seemed to contract around her words. A murmur ran through the gallery, softer than applause but louder in meaning. Some spectators blinked back tears, their faces lit by the glow of their phones as they recorded the moment. A woman in the audience whispered, "That's my story too." Even across the aisle, a handful of Republicans avoided her eyes, suddenly fascinated with the papers in front of them. Trump scoffed, but the force of his insults no longer carried. His laughter rang hollow, bouncing back against walls that no longer absorbed it. Camera zoomed close on his face, catching the tightness at his jaw, the flicker of something that looked less like confidence and more like unease. His attack had drawn blood. Yes, but not hers. His cruelty had exposed itself, and the contrast to Jasmine's composure was stark, undeniable, unforgiving. Social media detonated in real time. The clip spread instantly, split into two halves, his sneer against her defiance, cruelty against courage. Hashtag sword, hashtag never bow, hashtag struggle lives here, hashtag Crockett vs Trump. Commentators called it a turning point. This wasn't just debate, it was survival on full display. Jasmine remained standing, her shoulders square, her voice one last time steady and cutting. You can mock where I come from, you can mock how I look, how I sound. But what you cannot do is erase the millions who stand with me, because I am them and they are me. The gallery erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper, a thrum of recognition, a pulse of unity that vibrated through the chamber and out into the streets. Yet even as her words resonated, an ominous tension pressed against the walls. Outside, the chants had grown louder, angrier, the city bowling just beyond the marble steps. And as the chamber steadied itself, the chilling question remained. She had withstood his lowest blow, but could she survive the storm gathering beyond these doors? The Capitol dome loomed like a torch against the night sky, but outside its marble walls, fire was the true light. Crowds that had gathered since dawn had now exploded into chaos, chants colliding with shouts, fists swinging, flags ripped from poles and set ablaze. One side screamed Trump forever, while the other were justice for all. The air crackled with rage, smoke rising from trash bins overturned and barricades shoved aside. Sirens wailed, blue and red lights cutting through the black, their reflections flickering on tear-streaked faces. Washington was no longer just a capital, it was a battlefield. Police in riot gear locked shields, holding lines that buckled and reformed under the pressure of thousands pressing against them. The metallic thud of batons against shields echo, like war drums, matched by the thunder of boots stomping the pavement. Protesters surged forward, only to be pushed back in waves of confusion, their voices rising higher, sharper, until they merged into one roar that shook the very steps of Congress. The heat of burning flags spread a bitter scent into the air, smoke curling skyward as if the country itself were exhaling its fury. Reporters huddled behind camera crews, voices raised above the chaos, their words carried instantly into living rooms across America. "This is bigger than a hearing," one anchor declared breathlessly, the nose of the crowd bleeding into her mic. "This is no longer politics, this is a civil reckoning." Another network cut to live footage of clashes at the barricades, the anchor's voice trembling as he described the city teetering on the edge of violence. Helicopters swooped lower now, spotlights scouring the crowd like judgment, illuminating faces twisted in rage, in desperation, in unyielding defiance. In the swirl of chaos, voices clung to Jasmine's words from inside. Protesters on her side shouted, "We'll never bow," echoing the very line she had hurled back at Trump. Across from them, Trump's supporters jeered, spitting her name like an insult. The clash wasn't just political, it was visceral, personal, a nation tearing itself apart in real time, each camp convinced the soul of America was theirs to defend. Social media scrolled like wildfire. Clips of Jasmine standing defiant replayed against images of burning flags, split-screen comparisons between her calm in the chamber and the storm outside. Hashtags multiply. Hashtag never bowed. Hashtag civil reckoning. Hashtag Crockett vs. Trump. Commentators warned of escalation, some calling it protest, others civil war in miniature. Every refresh of the feed carried new images: broken glass, overturned police barriers, smoke swallowing the night sky. And yet, through the chaos, something deeper pulsed beneath the nose, a question larger than partisanship, larger than rage. Would Jasmine's words, born from a place of struggle and resolve, carry the power to calm a nation spiraling into fire? Or would they pour fuel onto the streets already burning, igniting something that no gavel, no speech, no law could ever contain? On the sidewalks outside the barricades, cameras found faces that carried the weight of America's divide. A young immigrant mother clutched her daughter's hand, tears cutting down her cheeks as she spoke into a trembling microphone. She said, "What we've been waiting to hear. My family came here with nothing, and every day we fight to be seen as American. Jasmine, she fights for us." Her daughter tugged at her sleeve, wide-eyed, as if not fully understanding why her mother cried but sensing that history had pressed itself onto their shoulders. A few blocks away, a veteran in a faded uniform jacket stood tall amid the noise, his voice rough but steady as he declared, "I served this country so the truth could still mean something." Jasmine Crockett reminded us that freedom isn't about who shouts the loudest, it's about who protects the weakest. The crowd around him cheered, lifting signs higher, the words painted bold, "Dilders, not screamers." His conviction echoed like a battle cry from a man who had once fought with weapons, but now chose to fight with witness. Yet across town, in a diner lit by neon signs and broadcast TVs, a small-town worker wiped grease from his hands and shook his head at the coverage. "Trump's the only one who ever spoke for folks like me," he said, the bitterness raw in his voice. "She can talk fancy all she wants, but it's just more politics. We need someone who'll break the system, not lecture us about it." His coworkers nodded, the divide clear in their weary eyes. To them, Jasmine was not a champion, but another threat to the world they believed they were losing. The nation's soul seemed to stretch between these voices, torn but unignorable. For every shout of defiance, there was a cheer of hope. For every tear shed in relief, there was a fist clenched in anger. The cameras captured it all, feeding it back to millions who saw themselves reflected on one side or the other. Yet through the swirl of rage and loyalty, one truth emerged: the eyes of the country, whether in love or in hate, were turning toward Jasmine Crockett. And the question that now rippled across the airwaves, whispered in living rooms, shouted in streets, was this: would her stand remain just a moment in politics, or could it swell into something larger, something that rewrote what America dared to believe about itself? The internet ignited like dry timber meeting flame. Within minutes, hashtag Stand With Jasmine surged to the top of global trends, eclipsing sports, entertainment, even international crises. Millions replayed the clip of her standing firm while Trump erupted, their timelines filled with captions like "Strength is silence" and "This is the America we need." Celebrities, athletes, and activists weighed in, resharing her words, turning a congressional clash into a cultural moment. TikTok flooded with remixes of her calm stare set against thunderous music, while Instagram stories plastered her quote across neon backdrops. But the other side roared back just as quickly. Trump's loyalists flooded the feeds with hashtags of their own, but they were drowned out by a single post that shattered the quiet Trump himself, breaking his 92 seconds of humiliation with a tweet in all caps, "Total hoax. She will pay." The words exploded across the screen like a fist slammed against the table, echoed instantly in news alerts, retweeted thousands of times within seconds. Cheered, some recoiled, but none could ignore it. The former president had declared war not just on Jasmine, but on the truth itself. Inside the Capitol chamber, aides scrambled to show her the tweet. Reporters whispered urgently, their phones glowing in the dimmed light, their faces pale with the realization that the battle was no longer confined to the room. It was spilling into every device, every home, every heart. Jasmine glanced down at the words, and then lifted her gaze with the faintest, almost imperceptible smile. "Truth doesn't need caps lock," she murmured, her voice calm, her pose a direct contrast to the frenzy outside. Cameras caught it instantly, the moment already destined for headlines and hashtags of its own. For every shout of rage online, there were 100 voices rising in solidarity. Mothers, veterans, students, activists, each adding their own story under the hashtag, each tying their lives to her stand. The storm of no's only grew louder, not weaker, as the clash expanded beyond politics into a full-blown cultural reckoning. And yet, beneath the tidal wave of tweets and hashtags, a darker question loomed, trembling on the edge of every news anchor's voice. This was no longer just a hearing, no longer just a clash of words. Trump had been cornered, humiliated before the world, and his pride had only one language left: retaliation. The nation braced, uncertain, and terrified of one thing. What would his next move be when even power itself seemed to slip from his grasp? The chamber buzzed with the aftershocks of Trump's online fury when a subtle gesture cut through the noise. A Republican senator, one known for his silence more than his speeches, leaned forward from the backbench. His eyes darted quickly toward Trump, then toward Jasmine. In a motion so small it might have gone unnoticed, he slid a folded note across the polished desk, passing it down the row until it landed at Jasmine's seat. She opened it beneath the table, her hand steady though her pulse quickened. In careful handwriting, just for words, "You're not alone." For a moment, her breath caught. In a chamber where party lines had been painted like trenches, those words were a fissure, an admission that Trump's grip might not be iron after all. The cameras didn't see the note, but they caught her eyes lifting, scanning the room until they found the senator's. He didn't nod, didn't smile, only held her gaze long enough to tell her the risk he had just taken was real. Trump noticed, he always noticed, his head snapped toward the back row, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. The smirk he had worn so easily earlier was gone, replaced by something harder: suspicion, betrayal. He shifted in his chair, muttering under his breath, scanning his allies as though daring them to meet his stare. Some did not. They fidgeted, looked away, busied themselves with papers they weren't reading. The fortress he thought unshakable suddenly looked like it had cracks running through its walls. Journalists in a gallery picked up the shift instantly, scribbling notes about the unease spreading across Republican ranks. One reporter whispered to her colleague, "He feels it. He knows he's bleeding support." Outside, the crowd's chants carried on, but inside, the real battle was shifting quietly, dangerously, like tectonic plates before an earthquake. Jasmine folded the note carefully and slid it back into the folder, her expression unchanged, her silence steady. But she felt it the first ripple of something bigger than courage. It was validation, proof that truth, even whispered in ink, had power. And the nation, though it didn't yet know, was watching the first fracture in a wall that once seemed impenetrable. Trump clenched his fists, his glare sweeping the chamber like a storm searching for the traitor. And the question lingered in every trembling heartbeat of that room. Was this the first crack in his empire of loyalty or the beginning of its collapse? Jasmine rose slowly, the chamber still vibrating with tension, her hand resting lightly on the red folder as if anchoring herself to its weight. She looked out across the room at allies who had cheered her, at opponents who had jeered her, at the undecided who sat in silence, and then into the cameras that carried her voice to millions beyond these marble walls. Her tone was steady, almost solemn, but it cut with a clarity no insult could match. Justice is not partisan, it's human, and it starts here. Her words rolled into the silence, and then she began to weave them into history, threading the present to the past. She spoke of Martin Luther King Jr., whose dream was not a slogan but a demand. Of civil rights leaders who marched through beatings and fire hoses so that a chamber like this could one day hear her voice. Of modern families still fighting to be seen, still told, "They do not belong," still standing where struggle lives. Her voice rose not in volume but in gravity, every sentence etched with the conviction of lived truth. This is not about red or blue. It is about right and wrong. About a country that cannot belong to one man's fear, but to every person's hope. The chamber stirred. Some Republicans shifted uneasily, eyes cast down, while Democrats leaned forward, nodding, hands tightening into fists on their desks. And then it happened. The first hands came together, a clap that echoed across the chamber. It grew, building into a wave until half the room was on its feet in a standing ovation, their applause thunderous, their faces lit with something more than politics recognition, relief, a spark of courage reflected in her words. But the other half stayed seated, their faces hard, their silence sharp. Trump glared across the aisle, lips pressed tight, his fists gripping the desk as the roar of applause rattled the very chamber he once commanded. The cameras captured it all, one half of Congress rising with Jasmine, the other rooted in defiance, a perfect image of a nation split down the center. She stood tall amid the ovation, her voice steady as the clapping began to fade. Justice begins when we decide that silence is no longer enough. Tonight, we decide. The chamber was electrified, but the divide was undeniable. And the question that hung in the air, as clear as the echoes of her words, was brutal in its simplicity. Would half a chamber standing be enough to tip the scales of a fractured nation, or would the weight of silence still hold America hostage? Screens across the nation lit up in unison as networks scrambled to seize the moment. CNN's banner screamed, in bold rate, "Crockett seizes the narrative." MSNBC cut live to commentators calling it the most defining moment in a congressional hearing in decades. On phones and tablets, clips of Jasmine's words flooded feeds, spliced with historic footage of civil rights marches, her calm voice overlaying images of protest and struggle. It was no longer just a hearing, it was being framed as a turning point, a cultural reckoning broadcast in real time. Fox, however, spun a different story. Their chyron read, "Radical Crockett hijacks hearing." Their hosts leaned into the camera, voices dripping with outrage, accusing her of grandstanding and political theater, but even as they railed, split-screen polls told a different story. Public sentiment, measured in live reactions, surged overwhelmingly in Jasmine's favor. Her words had cut across party lines, her composure contrasting too starkly with Trump's fury to be ignored. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was combustible. The ovation for Jasmine had not died completely. Its echoes lingered in the tension, in the uncomfortable shifting of Republicans in their seats, in the hushed murmurs of Democrats who knew something irreversible had just been set in motion. Trump sat stiff, his jaw tight, his chest heaving, his hand gripping the desk so hard his knuckles drained white. The cameras drank it in, his silence, his loss of control, his seething rage broadcast to millions, and then he snapped. Shoving his chair back with a screech of metal, Trump rose abruptly, his voice erupting like an aftershock. "This is a witch hunt, a total witch hunt." He jabbed a finger across the chamber, his face crimson, his words spilling fast and frantic. "She's a fraud. This whole thing is a disgrace, and the American people know it." His allies scrambled to cheer, banging tables in forced support, but the volume was hollow, the energy fractured. Without waiting for order, Trump turned sharply, storming toward the exit. Cameras swiveled and followed, capturing the trail of aides rushing behind him, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Witch hunt, witch hunt." The image broadcast to the nation was unmistakable, the former president retreating, under the glare of evidence and the weight of a woman's words. Journalists in the gallery typed furiously, one headline drafted before the door had even closed. "Trump walks out as Crockett holds the floor." Social media detonated again, hashtags multiplying, hashtag Trump storms out, hashtag witch hunt walk, hashtag Crockett seizes the moment. The divide sharpened, but the optics were inescapable. Trump had fled, and Jasmine still stood. The chamber buzzed with the shock of what had just happened, the air thick with realization that history had turned a corner. Some whispered he had shown weakness, others that it was strategy, but one question pressed harder than all the rest. Would walking out be the act of defiance that rallied his base, or the single biggest mistake that marked the beginning of his downfall? The chamber door slammed open, and Donald Trump stormed back in like a general unwilling to accept defeat. His tie hung loose, his face flushed, and his fists clenched as though the silence of his absence had only stoked his fury. Reporters scrambled to their feet, cameras whirring to capture his return, every lens locked on the man who refused to leave the battlefield. He marched to the microphone, his voice booming with the desperation of a man cornered. "This is treason," he roared, finger stabbing toward Jasmine. "She is a traitor to this country, a traitor to the flag, a traitor to the American people." His words ricocheted off the marble walls like cannon fire, raw and reckless. Gasps tore through the gallery, Republicans banged tables in desperate rhythm, chanting "Traitor! Traitor!" as if trying to breathe life back into their wounded champion. Democrats shot to their feet, shouting objections, their voices drowned beneath the rising storm. The speakers gavel-hammered for order, but the chaos surged higher, louder, more dangerous than before. For a moment, it seemed the chamber itself might fracture under the weight of accusation and rage. But Jasmine stood, her presence cut through the noise before she even spoke. She stepped forward, her hands resting firmly on the desk, her voice clear and unyielding. "The only treason is betraying your own people." The words dropped into the chamber like a verdict, sharp enough to slice through chance, powerful enough to hush even the pounding fists. The air shifted, charged, every ear straining to absorb the blow she had just delivered. The crowd murmured in response, a low rumble at first, then swelling into a roar that shook the rafters. Spectators leaned forward, eyes wide, some nodding, some whispering to each other as though history had just been carved in stone before them. Journalists typed furiously, headlines already forming. "Crockett turns treason charge back on Trump." Cameras zoomed close to Trump's face, catching the flicker of disbelief in his eyes, the twitch at the corner of his mouth as her words lodged deeper than he expected. For the first time that night, the power dynamic had flipped completely, his rage no longer towering over the chamber, but collapsing inward under the weight of her truth. And yet, the battle wasn't finished. The silence after her words was electric, suffused with a single question that hung heavy in the air, trembling on the edge of destiny. Had Jasmine just landed the last blow, or was Trump preparing to unleash something even darker in his final stand? Jasmine rose slowly, as if every movement carried the weight of a nation. The chamber, still vibrating from Trump's accusation of treason, seemed to pause, breaths held, cameras fixed. She reached into her folder not for another document, not for more evidence, but for something older, something heavier than any signature or ledger. She lifted the small, worn booklet high above her head, its cover instantly recognizable, the Constitution of the United States. The silence that followed was reverent, electric. Her voice carried like a bell. "This is my shield. This is America's sword." The words rang against the marble walls, unshakable, undeniable. She turned, not just to face Trump, but to face the entire chamber, her eyes sweeping across both allies and enemies. "No man, no matter how loud he screams, can stand above this. Not a president, not a party, not even me. This is the voice of the people. This is the promise we are sworn to protect." The applause didn't come yet. It was as though the room itself needed a moment to grasp the enormity of what had just been spoken. Trump stood frozen, his lips trembled, but no words came. The camera zoomed in mercilessly, catching the flicker of hesitation, the quiet betrayal of fear in his eyes. For a man who lived on spectacle, silence had become his greatest enemy, and Jasmine had forced it upon him once more. In the press gallery, a journalist leaned toward her colleague, her whisper caught by a hot mic. "This is the moment that will define 2028. Around them, reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching history into permanence. On social media, screenshots of Jasmine holding the Constitution shot across the world, tagged with captions like "the shield" and "the sword." The chamber felt less like a ruin and more like a battlefield where one weapon had finally pierced through the nose. That as the weight of her words settled over the nation, another question coiled itself into the silence, sharp and haunting. Would history remember this night for the scream of a man losing power, or for the silence that proved he already had? The chamber fell into a heavy stillness as Jasmine stepped forward, her hands still clutching the worn Constitution. The cameras tightened their focus, and in that moment, it was no longer a congressional hearing, it was a direct line from her heart to millions of Americans watching at home. Her voice was steady, but it carried the raw edge of truth sharpened by fire. Justice is not partisan. It is human. She let the words hang, as if daring the silence itself to challenge her. We cannot let fear win. We cannot let lies define us. We must stand together. The chamber did not erupt in noise this time. Instead, there was a hush so profound it seemed the marble itself was listening. The cameras pulled back, the room dimming as her figure remained illuminated, solitary yet unbroken. Screens across America flickered. Her image beamed into kitchens, living rooms, crowded bars, quiet bedrooms, the voice of a woman standing where struggle lives, reaching into the veins of a divided nation. And then the screen faded to black, phones buzzed, timelines flooded, Hashtags cascading faster than networks could track. Hashtag stand with Jasmine. Hashtag shield answer. Hashtag never bow. Clips replayed endlessly, her words etched in subtitles, her face frozen in defiance. Supporters wept, critics seethed, but none could deny that the nation had been pierced by her message. As the feed cut out, her final words reverberated through the darkness, not as a plea, but as a challenge, sharp as the oath she carried in her hand. America, will you stand with me? And the question lingered like a flame, demanding an answer not just from the chamber, but from the soul of a country standing at the edge of its own reflection. True power isn't in the nose of anger, but in the courage to stand unshaken for what is just, even when the world tries to silence you. Jasmine's stand reminds us that history is written by those who choose conviction over fear. Now the question is yours. When the moment comes, what truth will you have the courage to defend? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.